Okay, I think we probably have a good group of folks, and I'll let more people in as they roll in. But I do
Okay.
want to welcome everybody to tonight's living classroom presentation by the Rivertown's Pollinator Pathway. And before I begin, I just want to say something personal, and that is, it's been a very challenging time and a very hard time for a lot of people, whether because of health or politics or whatever. And I always look for things that brighten my day. And I have to tell you that spending time with Cathy and thinking about what Cathy's going to talk about really has done that. And I hope it does it for all of you as well. What we're going to be talking about tonight is some really positive things, we'll see some beautiful pictures. We will get to hear about what each of us can do to make our world a better place. And I think it's really a wonderful message in a challenging time. So I thank everybody for coming tonight and listening. I hope you will get as much out of it as I know I will, which would be great. So let's begin. I'm still letting folks in, but I'll get going anyways. So everybody, welcome. Welcome to our next Living Classroom Series presentation of our Pollinator Pathway project here in the Rivertowns. The Pollinator Pathway project mission is to engage and educate community about pollinators and native plants and reducing pesticides. It's promoting public awareness about the crucial role that pollinators play and raising awareness about and preserving and protecting open space and parks, which is a really important thing to do in this time. Tonight, we're very lucky to be hearing from Cathy Ludden about native plant meadows. Cathy will talk about the importance of native plant meadows and how you can create one in your own yard and how you can create some in your community. And she'll also talk about the wonderful native plant meadow that has been created at the Greenburgh Nature Center and many other meadows around the country. Cathy, besides being a good friend, is the past president of the board of directors of the Greenburgh Nature Center, a member of the steering committee of the Native Plants Center at Westchester Community College, and the chairperson of the Native Plants and Shrubs Committee for the Planting Westchester, this wonderful initiative by the County of Westchester to educate people about planting and native plants and the like. And at the Nature Center, at the Greenburgh Nature Center, she initiated and led the development of the native plant meadow, a formerly degraded stretch of land right off Central Avenue that is now attracting many new species of pollinators and birds, as well as providing a peaceful refuge for human visitors. And for those of you who have not had an opportunity to see that meadow, you'll hear a little bit about it tonight, but I encourage you to put that into your calendar of things you want to do when spring reemerges and we hopefully get out social distancing, but get out of our house. So with that, I'm about to turn over to Cathy. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So you can save your questions at the end. If you want to put them in the chat, you're welcome to, but we will be having a whole session at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cathy.
So I will start the screen share at this point, if that's okay, and we'll see if we can get this thing to work. Is that working, Chet? Can you see it?
It's working fine, Cathy.
Great, great. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Chet, who has been a tireless advocate and promoter of the Pollinator Pathway project. He's done an astonishing job. And I would like to thank all of you who have taken an interest in pollinator gardens and recognize the importance of native plants for our environment. The work that has happened since this project began is really impressive. We have people throughout the community who have actually taken hands-on work in creating pollinator gardens, recognizing that, is that all right, Chet? Are we good?
Yes, we're good, Cathy.
Okay. Pollinator gardens have sprung up all around this community, And as somebody who's been involved in advocating for native plants for just about a decade now, I have to say it's incredibly exciting to see this thing really take off. People are getting it. They're understanding the connection between native plants and insects, especially pollinators. Bees, who are responsible for pollinating all of a huge number of our crops, as well as all flowering plants, and butterflies, whose larvae are the main food source for most of our native birds. Most of them have to have caterpillars to feed their babies. So the importance of this can't be overstated. And we have people who are actually working on this now. We're finding little patches of land, this one along the Croton Aqueduct Trail, where a young man named August Brosnahan decided that he wanted to start a pollinator garden. He got donations of plants. I helped him organize the beds a little bit, but he made it happen. Another friend of mine, Ann Myers, donated a pollinator garden, which we planted at the Greenburgh Nature Center. And these gardens are not only beautiful, they're really working. They are within a matter of days after the flowers start blooming, pollinators somehow find them, even in the midst of vast areas of otherwise degraded landscape, and they get there. So it's actually happening. Pollinators are benefiting from the gardens that you people, all of us, are making. But long before anybody started talking about pollinator gardens, before pollinators were in trouble, pollinators got most of what they needed from meadows. Native meadows, a meadow is really just any open area with a big diversity of plants. Usually trees and woody shrubs are missing, and it's just an open area, sunny usually, and loaded with incredible diversity of plants. Meadows go by different names in different parts of the country. Here on the West Coast, the soil is rocky and thin, the air is salty, but this meadow is a very established site and place with incredible plant diversity. Here, it's called a coastal plain. Throughout the central United States, for miles and miles, millions of acres, we had the shortgrass prairie. That's where the wild buffalo roamed for years. In other parts of the Midwest and up through my part of the country, we have grasslands, long grass prairie. And on the East Coast, on the islands, this happens to be in Nantucket, we have the sand plains, grasslands. Again, the soil is sandy, thin, trees don't grow because the soil really isn't conducive to that, but a vast number of grasses and flowering plants do take hold there. In our part of the country, in the Northeast and in many other areas that are much wetter, we have wetlands, marshes, bogs, stream and lakeside beds where native plants that are water-loving grow. And here in the Northeast, we have what are most frequently succession meadows. The Northeastern United States was very heavily forested, but what happens when a storm goes through and trees are uprooted or downed in the event of a fire, in the event of human activity with logging, an open area is no longer forest, but becomes a succession meadow where seeds of native grasses and flowers take hold. A diverse array of plants get established, then woody plants settle in, some shrubs, and eventually tree seedlings. And in time, the whole thing will return to forest. So what's the difference between a pollinator garden and a meadow? Well, for one thing, the size. A pollinator garden can be a tiny little patch anywhere. A meadow requires more land, and the bigger the area, the more likely it is to qualify as a meadow. But the other really defining characteristic is plant diversity. In a real meadow, in a native meadow, a healthy meadow, you may find dozens of plant species within a couple of square feet. In our gardens, our pollinator gardens, we tend to plant fewer species, and they're things that we can find at the local nursery. Some of them are, they may all be native, but some of them may be cultivars or hybrids, things that nurserymen have developed over time. Whereas in a meadow, you can have an enormous diversity of plants within a square foot. For those of you who are native plant people and don't recognize any native plants in this meadow, it's because it's in Ireland. So all of these plants are native to Ireland, but look how many different species you can see down at ground level. A meadow also has more grasses typically than our pollinator gardens. Most meadows are at least 40% grasses. And the guideline, if you're trying to establish a new meadow, is to try to match that. And grasses are important. You shouldn't ignore them if you're planting a pollinator garden, because grasses are host plants for many species of Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, especially skippers. In a meadow, species mix much more freely. So you'll find different flowering plants, different grasses, all interspersed. They don't stay in nice organized beds the way some of our gardens do. You find plant layers. So there are tall plants, there's a mid-height level, and then there's a ground layer. The mid-height plants support some of the tall plants, keep them upright. The ground layer holds moisture in the soil, and all of these plants work together in a plant community. In a natural meadow, the plants freely seed themselves all over the place. They don't stay in one place. A large area allows for a lot of dispersal of seed by wind that blows through there and by animals that wander through. There's open pollination, so no one is controlling what plants are pollinated and what species might even intermix, natural mutations. So in a native meadow, pollinators can find whatever they need. Insect specialists find what they need because there are so many plant species available in that space. So on that Monarda blossom, you see a big fat bumblebee who's very happy, and he probably didn't have to go very far to find a dozen other plants that he could collect pollen and nectar from. So part of the pollinator crisis, the cause of the crisis that we're in today, is that our meadows are disappearing. The millions of acres of prairie that European settlers found when they came to North America, of all of that, only 4% of the native prairie remains in the central part of our country. Weed patches have become the successional meadow. And somehow I just lost this. Instead of a succession of native plants now, we get these weed-infested patches. There are 3,300 known species of invasive plants now established in North America, in the United States. So now, when a parcel of land is cleared by storm, fire, construction work, roadsides, the plants that settle in are not our native grasses and flowers, but they are invasive species: Japanese barberry, mugwort, multiflora rose, garlic mustard, plants that escape from gardens, English ivy, Japanese honeysuckle, vinca, pachysandra, creeping euonymus, all invade our woods and open areas. And my personal enemy number one, porcelainberry, which is pulling down trees all along our highways and in any untended areas. Porcelainberry, Chinese wisteria, and oriental bittersweet are vines that are doing enormous damage to natural areas. So why are these the plants that settle in now when we have an area that is cleared? Why are these the first plants in a succession? Why do they take over everywhere? Because that's all there is. That's all that's around us now. The spot you just saw, this one, is an empty lot in my neighborhood, right around the corner from me. It's been empty where a house was taken down years ago. And this is the lot across the street. And here's the other one across the street. There is nothing from either of those properties that could seed themselves even 50 feet across the street. So the plants that take hold are the invasive plants that are being distributed by birds, animals, by wind, because they're everywhere now. This style of landscaping that you're looking at is what I think Larry Weiner calls American neat and tidy. And it is the style of landscaping that dominates certainly suburban America. The lawn is a real issue, and we don't really have enough time tonight to detail all the evils of lawn, but just let me give you a few numbers. Right now in the United States, there are over 40 million acres of lawn. There are only 52 million acres of national park. So if you take all of our national parks together, the Everglades, Glacier, Yosemite, Denali, Yellowstone, all of that land is barely more than what we have planted in turf grass throughout the country. Lawns soak up, we're putting 8 billion gallons of water every day on lawns in the US. That's 32 gallons every day for every man, woman, and child in the US. Homeowners use as much fertilizer every year as all of agriculture. And the most commonly used pesticides on lawns have been shown in 75 different scientific studies to be linked to lymphoma. And who's most at risk for that? Our children, our dogs, our pets, because they're the ones who are out playing on the lawn most of the time. And all of that water that we pour on the lawns washes the pesticide and the fertilizer off into lakes and streams and into our groundwater. So while meadows are incredibly diverse ecosystems with so many different species of plants available for pollinators and all insects, lawn is the exact opposite. There's nothing available in lawn for any pollinator or for any insect except Japanese beetles that overwinter there. The good news, and what I really want to talk to you about tonight, is that lawn is the best place for meadow. It's open, sunny, the trees have already been cleared, most of the weeds are not there because we put herbicide on it. So meadows are an ideal place, or lawns are an ideal place to convert to meadow. It's the easiest place to convert to a meadow. So the meadow then doesn't need extra water, so no irrigation. It doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need pesticide. And you only have to mow it once a year. The how-to of doing a meadow, where I started, is this book by Catherine Zimmerman, which is really a how-to guide on how to start meadows. And she has several different methods that she describes in great detail to clear the land and get it ready for meadow planting and different approaches to planting. I have tried and been involved with 2 of her meadows, the speed meadow and the seed meadow. The speed meadow is good for smaller spaces, maybe part of a lawn. It's fast for sure. It tends to be a lot more expensive because you use containers, nursery bought plants, maybe plugs, but more likely containers. A seed meadow is much less expensive and much better for a bigger area, but it takes longer and it requires some special expertise. This was my front yard in 2011. And I, probably like many of you, had way too much lawn. I had already heard about native plants, so I wanted to do something about it. So I decided I would try Catherine Zimmerman's speed method. What she suggests is planting nursery containers directly into the turf. So you can define an area, stop mowing the lawn, and start planting plants in there. I had planted 3 young oak trees in this front lawn the year before. And so at the end of that season, I put the goldenrod that you see here, some baptisia, a couple of native grasses, a few coneflowers. It was not much. And just let that go until the next year and stopped mowing the grass between them. And the way you do this, you can see I just plunked the nursery containers right down into the lawn, leave the lawn grass. And then Catherine Zimmerman says, and you can decide to edit that later if you want to. Well, in the spring of 2012, I started putting more and more plants in the lawn. And by the fall of 2012, I had gone, as I am inclined to do, probably a bit crazy and a bit too far. And I just kept buying plants and sticking them in the ground. And over on the right-hand side here, you can see that we have lawn grass still there. But on the left side, I started pulling out the lawn grass because I wasn't sure I knew what I was doing, to tell you the truth. So by the summer, though, this really is, that fall, I decided I had to put in some retaining walls. I was worried that my neighbors would think this was just an unkempt lawn. So I splurged on this and I put in a couple of retaining walls. And the next spring, I just continued planting. So up here is that goldenrod that you saw. Here are the 3 little oak trees. And here are all the nursery containers as I kept going. So the first season, I just did this little bit here. The second season, I planted a little farther down the hill here. And after I put in the retaining walls, I just kept planting all the way along here. Let me just say it's great exercise. It's definitely an expensive way to go, but speed is right. This is that same spot in July. So in April, it was this, and in July, it was this. And I got pretty excited, but it looked really a lot like a pollinator garden because it was sort of organized and not as diverse as you might want. By that fall though, by October, it was looking pretty glorious. And a week later in the fall, it looked like that. I did a shrub border both above and below the retaining wall so it would look organized. And then the coolest thing about this was by October, when all of those plants were really established, I cut off the water. So the whole left side of this yard was still in lawn, but this part, about 1/3 of my front yard, was now established plants, native prairie plants and meadow plants, and I cut off the irrigation. Now, why could I do that? Here's one of the great things to know about meadow plantings. This is a chart that was done specifically to show the root systems of various prairie and also meadow plants. And over here on the left, you see turf grass. Going down on the sides is the feet of depth of roots. So here's 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. Here's turf grass. The roots go down 2, maybe 3 inches. Here's goldenrod. Where did I just lose my cursor? Here. Here's goldenrod. The roots go down 7 feet. Here are some of my favorite plants. We have switchgrass. The roots go down 10 feet. Baptisia, wild indigo, the roots go down 8 or 9 feet. And even little prairie dropseed, one of my favorites, the roots go down, here, his prairie dropseed, the roots go down 4 or 5 feet. So I joked to my husband, after this meadow was established, if somebody who buys this house someday in the future decides they want to return all of that to turf grass, they're in for a rude awakening because these plant roots go to China and they are not coming out and they're not going to be taken over by something that only grows this deep. By the next summer, these plants had started to move around quite a bit. They started to get a little wilder and it started to look a little less garden and a little more meadow. And in the spring, I cut it down and let it go, no water. And over the course of the second summer, it grew into this. But meadows are not at all static. They're not stagnant. They change dramatically. So this was the summer of 2014 with a meadow that I really planted in 2012. A couple of years later, my oaks had gotten to be really big and they started shading things out. So you can see the area under the oak has turned into basically a shade garden. This is the same area this past October. It's too small to be a real meadow, but it is diverse. And I've had a lot of volunteer plants because there are other native plants on my property. So I've had things volunteer in here, white snakeroot, violets, wood aster, and I've had things like cardinal flower and coneflower pop in here from other parts of the property. And look how big the oaks have gotten. So by October of this year, this is lawn, and over here is the meadow. And it gets wilder, but looking down from the meadow toward the property across the street, you can see American Neat and Tidy there. We have a perfectly manicured lawn and annuals along a path, but I have never gotten a single complaint from anyone that this meadow looked too wild or too crazy or looked like an unkempt property. And that is a consideration. If you're going to plant a meadow, you really do have to think about the fact to a lot of people, it looks wild. And people who have started meadows have from time to time had to deal with criticism from neighbors. So the other method suggested by Catherine Zimmerman is a seeded meadow. A seed meadow is for a much larger area. You could never plant something like this with container plants. My sister and her husband had a property in Minnesota, and between their driveway and the county road was just a big flat area that they regularly had to mow, and it was a pain. And so they decided to hire this company, Prairie Restorations in Minnesota, who are experts on prairie plants. And that company prepared the soil and seeded it. The process, as Catherine Zimmerman describes it, and as my sister and her husband experienced in their meadow, is the first year after it's seeded, as the plants start to come up, it doesn't look like very much. And just when you start to see the first flowers, you have to cut the whole thing down, because the method for a seeded meadow is to keep the weeds and the non-native plants from going to seed before the native seeds can germinate and develop their root systems. So in the first season, the meadow has to be cut maybe 3 times. It starts to get tall at 12 inches, you cut it back to 3 inches. The next time it gets a little taller, you cut it back to 6 inches. The next time maybe you cut it back to 8 inches. But and then the second year, it has to be cut at least once, maybe twice, before you start to let it really go and turn into meadow. So I was really excited about this idea, but I was out of land. And at this point, I would really like to suggest to you to think about that. I couldn't do a seeded meadow on my property. I just didn't have that much space. But where in your experience is there a big open patch of land or a big open patch of sort of degraded, weed-infested land that maybe should be considered for a meadow? Maybe part of a schoolyard that's not being used for soccer or baseball, church property, a corporate campus, one of your local parks, or any area that you can think of where you'd rather see biodiversity than this. I was lucky enough to be on the board of the Greenburgh Nature Center, and we have about a 2-acre patch that ran right along Central Avenue, a very busy industrial corridor. It was all infested with mugwort and multiflora rose and all of the usual suspects in Westchester County. So we cleared the space, and it had, on the right is Alanthus, tree of heaven. We had always had over here a little fence with some beehives behind it. And so we decided we would keep that as a feature of the meadow. But then we hired this guy. Bill Boyce is a landscape architect, but has also worked on landscape restorations. He was involved with the restoration of the Meadowlands, which is a terribly polluted area that's been partially brought back to life. So Bill came in and designed the meadow for us. And he laid out areas that would be seeded meadow. We had some plants that we decided to save there. There were some birches on this side. There's this little tiny white pine here, which is now about 5 or 6 feet. And we had a beautiful stand of bayberry. We had some grasses, native grasses that we had planted for a butterfly exhibit. But basically, Bill laid out this land and then it was cleared. And it had to be cleared mechanically with a machine that went down and dug out roots of woody plants. And then Bill laid this out. And then we were also incredibly lucky to get the services of Larry Weiner, who's sort of the guru in the Northeastern United States of meadows. Larry formulated the seed mix for this property. He does it with a very complex algorithm, really, based on his experience, where he chooses grasses and flowering plants that are suited to the particular site. So based on the soil, the amount of light, water, he will formulate a seed mix. And then he also has to make decisions about which seeds germinate how quickly and which seeds generate plants that are more aggressive, so that he balances the amount of seeds with the likelihood of the plants germinating and how quickly they will spread. And then I apologize for the quality of this photo, but this is a handful of sand with Larry's seed mix in it. We've got buckets and we filled them with sand, and then we mix the seeds into the sand to give something to hold the seeds as you distribute them. And then we walked around the area that had been cleared and raked, and we hand cast the seed around the property. This was our erstwhile team of meadow planters. So it's Bill, myself, Larry Weiner, and then Travis Brady, who's the director of programming at the Greenburgh Nature Center. And the four of us really were able to do the seeding of probably a little over an acre and a half in a day. So it's doable. You cast the seed and then you lightly rake it in, and then you have big heavy rollers that get pushed over the seed to sort of press it into the ground. Bill had also designed some features for the Greenburgh Nature Center Meadow that would make it a place for our educational programs and as a sort of a spiritual retreat for the community. This is a stone classroom he designed. I think our educators call it Stonehenge. But he also planted an oak circle. So over here on the left, there's a circle of 5 young oak trees. And my hope was that that would ultimately become a quiet place of refuge for adults, and another little classroom for students, outdoor classroom. So here you can see the oaks again on the left. So we knew that it would be a while before the meadow looked like anything. So in the spring of the first year, we seeded that meadow in December. And then the spring of the next year, we put in some native plants and grasses in sort of a flower bed arrangement so that the area would look a little better a little sooner. So I guess that part of it was quasi-speed meadow. And in the next year, those flowers came up. By spring, we had blooms. By summer, we had more. But the actual meadow part of itself still wasn't doing much. At the end of that season, though, after this summer, we did see some little plants coming up in the meadow in the first year. And just as soon as they started to appear, they were adorable. We got excited about them. We even saw some pollinators on them, and then we had to mow it down. So we didn't want the weed seeds all around it to get ahead of the native plants. So it was cut to the ground. Bill then came up with an idea that we all got excited about, of building a butterfly arbor. Every year at the Nature Center, we have a butterfly exhibit where we release live butterflies children come in and can see the butterflies. We only use native species. So the idea is that we would design the ends of the butterfly arbor more or less to suggest the wings of a butterfly. And I think you can see that here, this pattern a little bit. And then for the butterfly exhibit, we would hang a netting inside the structure and put a door on either end. And then at the end of the exhibit, we can just drop the nets, let all the butterflies out in the meadow, and there are species that belong there, so that's okay. This is what the meadow looked like at the end or at the beginning of the second season. You can see there's not much going on. It's been mown down. It was mowed again a couple times that year. But by fall of the next year, we had a meadow. So it did take 3 years. And in the third season, we let it go. We did not mow it. And it really started to happen. On the left is that old bayberry that we let stay, which is really pretty glorious. In the spring, like all meadows, this one changes day by day, season by season, and year by year. So in the spring, we have Baptisia and Penstemon. We start to get some Coreopsis a little later. This is a plant we did not plant that just existed in the Nature Center grounds called World Loosestrife. It gets little yellow flowers all the way along its stem, a native plant. You can see a little Solomon seal and some other plants. And now this is starting to really look like a meadow. Down at ground level, you can count many different species, a dozen or so, maybe more, different species within a square foot. Grasses, flowers, and a variety of flowers. We're starting to get more and more diversity in the meadow with each passing year. And so the meadow looks great up close, but it also looks great at a distance. There are a whole array of paths to walk in the meadow, places to sit. Here's some switchgrass this fall with goldenrod peeking through. And the biodiversity is definitely happening. We're getting a whole array of pollinators, a wasp and at least 2 species, I think 2 species of bees on this is mountain mint, on the hardy ageratum, somebody else, I can't tell you what that pollinator is. This one you all know. And this is a hairstreak butterfly, also on the mountain mint. So biodiversity is happening. Milkweed pods with a beetle, happy bumblebee, and we get some other visitors that come through here, adding to the interest of the place. The features of the meadow that Bill designed are growing up and becoming wonderful places to go. So this is the Oak Circle 4 years later. It's a great place to sit on a summer afternoon. The stone classroom is used this way and is a big hit with both our educators and the students. The butterfly arbor with the nets down becomes the place where we release butterflies. We let kids participate in the opening of the butterflies and releasing them. And at the end of the season, they can help with the raising of the net and letting the butterflies go out into a then well-developed meadow. We have education programs for adults as well. The beehives are educational both for kids and for adults. And the meadow is a popular place for tours. I'm leading a group of people through the meadow at this point. And people are learning that meadows are places of wonder and beauty and joy. So if they're messier than lawn, isn't that a good thing? Do we really want America neat and tidy? Lawn is great for walking through a meadow on. It makes a great path, makes a decent edging, kind of defines the difference between a garden and a parking lot. That's a good use of lawn. but it's not the interesting part. It's not what you look at when you're going through a pollinator garden or a meadow like this one at the Native Plant Center. It's not where the action is. The grass is just the path. It's not where you see interesting things and learn things. It's just really the way you get to the meadow. So that's it. I hope you will think about places where you might plant a meadow, and check out Catherine Zimmerman's book for techniques for doing it and clearing the land and planting. People like Larry Weiner, Neil Diebol are very useful, incredibly expert on the larger scale projects. And your home meadow, if you can take a chunk of your yard and make a pollinator garden, you can add a few more grasses, maybe expand it a bit more, and lean from pollinator garden a little more toward meadow. Thank you. Questions?
Cathy, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I'd like to open it up for questions. If for those of you who have a question, if you go down to your participant button at the bottom and you click that, you'll see that I believe you should be able to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I will be able to see that, and you can unmute yourself and ask questions. So I see in a chat, there's a question from Carmenia D'Angelo. Excuse me if I mispronounce your name, or at least Dominic Schmidt. What about deer? How do you deal with deer in your meadow?
Great question.
Cathy?
Great question. All of us in Westchester County who are planting shrubs and plants and gardens that we care about, deer are the constant bane of our existence. One of my colleagues on the steering committee of the Native Plant Center said she's convinced that deer select plants mostly on the basis of price. So your most expensive shrubs are the ones they go for first. There are deer that wander through the meadow, both at the nature center and in my front yard, and I have not seen literally any impact from deer on the meadow. I think they're not keen on grasses. They don't like a lot of the more aromatic perennials that are in there. And in my property on the other side, past the green grass, there are hosta all along the street. And the deer came through and they mowed that down like a salad bar. And maybe they walked through the meadow, but I saw no predation anywhere on the meadow. So I think, I will say, there are some plants like coneflowers and asters that are very popular with woodchucks, rabbits, probably deer. So if you tuck those plants in around the things that are really aromatic, like mountain mint and monarda and anishyssop, the deer just seem to leave it be. So I think meadows are a great solution to the deer problem.
So Cathy, Carol Summerfield asked, it appears there was no amendment or manipulation of the soil other than removing grass as invasive. Is that correct?
Also, good point. Meadow plants don't like rich soil. I made a mistake in another bed on my driveway of planting little blue stem. And it was a place where there had been other shrubs. So it got compost and fertilizer. There was irrigation there. And the blue stem, which is supposed to stand straight up, just laid down because the soil was too rich and there was too much water. If you remember that root chart, these are plants that are designed to withstand not only drought and very poor soil quality, but fire. Prairies and meadows burn, and that actually is good for them. My sister's meadow, that company, Prairie Restorations, came back and once or twice they burned that meadow. Not something we can do in Westchester, but what it tells you is that you don't need to improve the soil. Larry Weiner once said, never, ever, never, not ever, never fertilize a meadow.
Another question, Cathy. Did you use any mulch in establishing these areas?
No, and that's something I'm thinking a lot about these days, because even on my other flower beds that are they're all native perennials, shade, sun, whatever, I had always mulched. And I heard wonderful speaker last year who said there's not one plant in North America that evolved growing in shredded bark. And you're gonna go, oh, right. So one of the problems with mulch is that the seeds from your native plants fall on that and then they don't germinate, because the reason you put down mulch in part is to prevent weeds. So that means all of those plants that should self-sow and spread seed all over the place are falling into shredded bark instead of onto soil where they might germinate. So for the most part, no, you would not mulch. In a flower bed, if you've got plants that are planted a few feet apart, in shrub borders, it does reduce your work. It's not necessarily great for the plants, but it's good for your gardeners, but not in a meadow.
Cathy, another question. Does a meadow always have to be in the sun? Are there partial shade meadows as well?
Most meadows are sunny. And if you just look back at the pictures I showed at the first as to where meadows are naturally occurring, they're places where trees have gone down for the most part. There are little pocket meadows in the Northeast that we think of as sort of the shady glen. Those are usually very much successional, and they're also usually pretty wet. So it'll be the moisture in a shady area like that prevents trees and shrubs from establishing. So you can, and there certainly are lots and lots of native plants that do well in shade. But then you're thinking more of woodland understory than meadow.
So another question from Cynthia Roberts: have you gotten any mudwort popping up in these meadows, and how have you dealt with it? And then a comment back that mugwort is a medicinal herb. So I don't know if you've taken advantage of that or not.
So it's medicine I would gladly somebody else have. Mugwort is vicious, and we have struggled with it. This year, my husband and I cleared a lot of mugwort out of our front yard meadow. And I've been told different things, contradictory things. Larry Weiner says it's better to cut plants right at the ground, weeds, including mugwort at the ground, because as soon as you pull them up, all the seeds that are being dispersed from invasive plants everywhere have fresh soil where they can settle. So you actually can make your problem worse. That said, Guy Pardee of Suburban Natives, who is helping me with the maintenance of the meadow at the Nature Center, he's convinced that digging the roots out of mugwort is the way to go, or at least yanking it as far as you can. So what we have done sometimes is replaced mugwort that we've pulled right away with a container plant that will drop into that spot that we've cleared. Mugwort, like a lot of these other garlic mustard and others, is really difficult.
So here's a question from Jan Blair. After you plant the meadow for the first year, you said when the plants started to bloom, you mowed. What month and how often do you mow a new meadow to avoid weeds?
Okay. Both Larry Weiner and Neil Diebold and Catherine Zimmerman give more detailed instructions for this. But the idea is actually in that first winter, when we seeded the meadow, Larry included in the seed mix something he calls a cover crop, which was winter rye, which is an annual. And those seedlings occupy the space and germinate very quickly because they're designed to do that. So in the first spring, you get the native, the rye or the cover crop, or all of the weeds and invasives that tend to come up first. The invasives because they're already there. In the meantime, all of your native seeds are sitting on the ground waiting for enough sun, a little rain to start germinating. If you let the invasive plants or the cover crop get tall, it shades out those little seedlings. So really when the cover crop and the whole meadow gets to be about 6 inches tall, you cut it back to about 3 inches, which keeps sunlight on the little seedlings. Then you let it go again. And how fast that happens is dependent on the season, rainfall, things like that. But in that first season, it's cut 3 or 4 times so that you don't let any of the invasives or the cover crop go to seed, all while you're letting the little natives start to germinate and come up. And in the second year, we cut it again after the meadow got to be about 1 foot tall for the same reasons. But by then we were starting to see some of the native plants come through. And so after that happens, about midway through the second season, you don't mow any longer. You can go through and selectively cut the invasives, which we had to do.
So another question, this may have been part of your answer for the last one, but how would you treat a piece of land that is mostly invasives right now?
Well, we did that. I mean, you can see what that piece of land looked like at the Nature Center. It was who's who of the weeds of Westchester County. There was everything in there. We had mile-a-minute weed and porcelainberry and lots and lots of ailanthus, the tree of heaven. So the whole thing had to be cleared mechanically. Now, I will tell you, and this is very controversial in the meadow world, some of the professional meadow masters like Larry Weiner and Neil Diebold, maybe Prairie Restorations, I'm not sure, they use Roundup and they will go through and just try to kill everything that's there, and they'll kill it chemically. Some companies will torch it with flamethrowers, basically. At the Nature Center, there was no one who felt good about Roundup, so we had to clear it mechanically. So there's a machine that is a tiller that goes through and tries to, if not dig up the roots, to shred the stalk of woody plants enough so that they can't resprout. And it's not perfect. We have, through those first 3 years especially, we had to do a lot of hand invasive control. That is labor intensive. As time goes on, it's less and less. And my front yard meadow, less and less every year.
So this is a question from Nikki Coddington. What would you say to a corporation with a large stretch of lawn to encourage them to convert to a meadow and address their concerns of cost of maintenance?
The cost of maintenance?
Yes. So
I should have started with that. It is far cheaper to have a meadow than to mow, than lawn. You have to pay a yard crew to mow it. There's the cost of water, fertilizer, pesticide, all of that stuff. Meadow is cheap once it's established compared to lawn. In fact, some states, I think Maryland is one of the states that is allowing more and more of its highway medians to be treated like meadow. So it's mown once a year in the spring, which is how you maintain most meadows. So they're cut in the spring, and then the new plants come up from their deep rootstock, and that's that. No other maintenance is necessary unless there's some invasive control that has to be done. For corporate parks, I've heard some stories that are troubling because what you first have to do is sell them on this concept. Basically, they have to hear what I just shared with all of you, what the difference is in biodiversity, the critical threat that pollinators and our songbirds are under, and understand that lawn is one of the reasons. I have talked to some people, somebody who did a meadow at a corporate headquarters, and the CEO partway through the second year came through and went, "This just looks like a wreck. It just looks like an unkempt lawn. Would somebody mow this damn lawn?" So without enough education, without a real understanding of what's happening, you can get that reaction. And there's a danger in doing community projects. If people don't really understand what's happening, they think you've just stopped caring, or you started to let things go. So one of the things I really recommend on a how-to with a community or a corporate project like that is first you have to get buy-in on the concept from all of the people who are going to be walking past this thing every day. They have to understand what they're looking at. And once they do, and if you can use signs saying, meadow in progress, look for butterflies, whatever, talk about the different host plants that are in there. Once people start to see it, they get pretty excited. They can get really invested in the stuff that they see happening. But there is an education process, pretty much like what we're doing right here, that I think has to precede that, or you can really run into a lot of resistance.
I think we're probably, it's now 8 o'clock, and while I know maybe people may have more questions, and if you do, you should feel free to email me or email Cathy directly. I think we're going to call it tonight. But Cathy, I'll just say this was exactly what I had hoped for, as I said at the beginning, of just something that is positive and hopeful, and a really great presentation. So I want to thank you for just a wonderful thing, and I appreciate everybody coming and listening to Cathy. I will be sending out news about our next Living Classroom session relatively soon, I hope. But until then, I hope everybody stays healthy and be well. Okay,
Thank you,
thanks.
Chet. I really appreciate the opportunity. Does the chat
Correct.
stay active for a little while so I can answer questions in chat?
I can do that. I will leave it open, and so you can do that.
Thank you, Cathy and Chet.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.